The first thing Carol noticed wasn't the house. It wasn't the flower beds she'd spent years perfecting, nor the maple tree that shaded the front yard every summer. It was the dock. She stood beside the SUV with one hand still gripping the luggage handle and stared toward the lake. For several seconds she didn't say a word. Then she blinked twice and pointed. "Did we buy a dock while we were in Colorado?" I followed her gaze. The answer was immediate. "No," I said slowly. "Not unless I've developed a sleep shopping problem." The words sounded ridiculous even as I spoke them, because there, stretching proudly into the water behind our property, was a dock. A large dock. A very permanent-looking dock. Not the kind somebody could throw together over a weekend with a few boards and a nail gun. This thing looked professionally built. Heavy wooden posts disappeared into the lake. Fresh treated lumber gleamed in the afternoon sunlight. A rope railing ran neatly along both sides. At the far end sat a mounted storage box that looked brand new, and tied to the dock were two boats. Two, not one. Two complete strangers had apparently decided our shoreline was now public property. Carol stared. I stared. The boats floated gently against the dock, as though they'd always belonged there. One carried a cheerful blue flag fluttering in the breeze. The other had a massive cooler sitting on deck, the sort of cooler people bring when they're planning to spend an entire day on the water. A man wearing sunglasses and a polo shirt stood at the far end of the structure. One hand shaded his eyes as he gazed across the lake. He looked relaxed, comfortable, like a man standing on property he owned. Then he noticed us, and waved, actually waved, a friendly little greeting. The casual wave of somebody who believed he belonged exactly where he was. Carol automatically waved back. The reflex lasted less than a second, then realization struck. She lowered her hand. "I just waved at a stranger standing on our dock." "You did." "I need coffee." She grabbed her suitcase and headed toward the front door. I remained standing in the driveway. Something else had caught my attention. A sign. It hung from one of the posts nearest the shoreline. Laminated. Professionally printed. Clean white background. Official-looking logo. The words were impossible to miss. Lakeview Shores Community Dock for resident use. Please be courteous and enjoy. I read it twice. Then a third time. The sign did not improve with repetition. Please be courteous and enjoy. On my property. That was a new one. I walked closer. The logo at the top belonged to the Homeowners Association. The HOA. The same HOA that had somehow decided to construct a waterfront structure on land my wife and I had owned for 11 years. No warning, no discussion, no permission, no letter, no phone call, nothing. Just a dock. A very expensive dock, a very illegal dock. And judging by the boats tied to it, a heavily used dock. The strangest part wasn't the structure itself. The strangest part was the confidence behind it. Whoever had ordered this hadn't tried to hide anything. They'd installed signs. They'd added logos. They'd invited residents to use it. That level of confidence suggested one of two possibilities. Either they possessed legal authority I didn't know about, or they were so convinced they couldn't be challenged that they hadn't bothered checking. Neither possibility made me particularly happy. Inside the house, Carol had already started a pot of coffee. The familiar aroma filled the kitchen. Usually returning home after a trip felt comforting. Today it felt like walking into a mystery. She handed me a mug. "You look angry." "I'm trying not to be." "How's that working?" "Poorly." She nodded. "That's what I thought." I walked toward the back windows. The dock remained visible through the glass. The boats bobbed gently. People laughed somewhere near the shoreline. The sound carried across the water, our shoreline, our property. A memory surfaced, 11 years earlier, the day we'd bought the house. Carol had fallen in love with the lake first. I had fallen in love with her reaction to it. She'd stood at nearly the same spot where I stood now, smiling like a child discovering a secret world. The shoreline had been the reason we'd chosen this home. The water, the privacy, the view, those things mattered. And somebody had decided they mattered less than a community project. I pulled out my phone. There was one person who always knew everything happening on this street. Dennis, my neighbor. Dennis had lived here longer than anyone else, 27 years. The man noticed everything. Not in an annoying way, in a terrifyingly accurate way. If a squirrel stole birdseed 3 houses away, Dennis probably knew what time it happened. If a contractor parked illegally, Dennis knew the license plate. He answered on the second ring. "You're home." I frowned. "How did you know that?" "You called." "Fair point." A brief chuckle. Then I got straight to it. "Tell me about the dock." The laughter disappeared immediately. Dennis released a long breath, the kind people take before telling a story. "Well," he said, "I've seen some strange things in 27 years. I believe that. I once watched a family of raccoons dismantle an entire patio set." I closed my eyes. "Only you would remember that." "It took them 3 months. Focus, Dennis." "Right." He paused dramatically. "I've never seen anything like this." That got my attention. Dennis wasn't easily impressed. "What happened?" 10 days after you left for Colorado, contractors arrived." My grip tightened around the coffee mug. "What kind of contractors?" "The expensive kind," he continued. "Heavy equipment, trucks, professional crew. They even brought a barge onto the lake." "A barge?" "For the support posts." I stared out the window. The dock suddenly looked even larger. Nobody questioned it? Oh, people questioned it. Dennis sounded delighted. "Frank walked over during construction." "Frank always walks over." "Exactly." "What did he ask?" "He asked what they were doing." "And?" Dennis laughed. "Patrice told him it was an approved community development project." I frowned. "Patrice?" "The HOA president." Of course it was. Patrice. The woman who treated every HOA newsletter like a presidential address. Patrice never simply announced things. She unveiled them, presented them, celebrated them. If the HOA installed a new mailbox, she'd write a 3-page email describing it as a transformative enhancement to neighborhood communication infrastructure. "And she approved this?" I asked. "Personally." Dennis sounded certain. "She said the HOA had authority over shared water access areas." I stared at the lake. The phrase immediately felt wrong. Shared water access areas. That wasn't terminology I'd ever seen in any HOA document. Apparently Frank agreed. "Frank checked the bylaws," Dennis continued. "Could he find it?" "Nope." The answer didn't surprise me. Neither did what came next. 3 days into construction, Patrice sent an email. I closed my eyes. Of course she did. What kind of email? The celebratory kind. "Meaning?" Dennis cleared his throat theatrically. "Exciting new community amenity, now open for resident enjoyment." I nearly choked on my coffee. "You are kidding." "I wish." The kitchen grew quiet. Outside, one of the boats pulled away from the dock. Its engine hummed softly across the water. The dock remained. Solid, permanent, confident, as if it had every right to exist. I had a growing suspicion it didn't. And if Dennis was right, the person behind it wasn't merely mistaken. She was convinced she could get away with it. That thought bothered me more than the dock itself, because people who made honest mistakes usually apologized. People who believed they were untouchable usually doubled down. I looked at the shoreline one more time. Something told me this situation was only beginning, and somewhere behind all of it stood a woman named Patrice, smiling confidently while standing on a legal disaster she didn't yet recognize. The lake shimmered in the afternoon sun. The dock stretched into the water like a declaration that somebody else's property belonged to the HOA now. The problem was simple. They had built it on the wrong man's land, and before this day was over, I intended to discover exactly how that had happened. The next morning, I sat at the dining room table with enough paperwork to make a tax auditor nervous. The dock was still there. I could see it through the back windows. Every time I looked up from the documents, it seemed larger, more permanent, more insulting. Carol set a fresh cup of coffee beside me and quietly returned to her chair. She knew me well enough to understand I had entered a very specific state of mind. The same state that had once led me to spend 3 days proving a contractor had overbilled us by $200. The same state that emerged whenever somebody confidently told me something that wasn't true. I wasn't angry anymore. Not exactly, I was focused. And that was usually worse. The first thing I pulled from the file cabinet was the original property survey from 11 years earlier. The document had yellowed slightly with age, but the measurements remained perfectly clear. I unfolded it carefully across the table. Carol glanced over her book. "Find anything?" "I've been looking for 3 minutes. You already have that look." "What look?" The one that says somebody's about to regret a decision. I ignored that. Mostly because she was probably right. The survey had been completed before we purchased the house. I remembered the surveyor clearly. A precise man who carried 3 pens in his shirt pocket and treated boundary lines with the seriousness of international borders. He had personally walked the property with me, every corner, every marker, every measurement. At the time, I had barely paid attention. I trusted professionals. Now I was grateful for every detail. I traced the shoreline boundary with my finger, then measured again and again. Finally, I sat back. The answer was impossible to misunderstand. The dock wasn't near our property line. It wasn't slightly over it. It wasn't in a grey area. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't close. The entire structure sat 14 feet inside our property boundary. 14 feet. A person could lie down twice between the dock and the property line and still have room left over. I looked toward the lake. The dock stood there proudly. 14 feet into land that belonged entirely to us. No shared access. No common property, no ambiguity. Private property, plain and simple. Carol lowered her book. Well, 14 feet, she blinked. 14? I nodded. Not inches. No. She stared out the window. That's not an accident. No. It's not even a good mistake. No. She picked up her coffee. That's a spectacular mistake. That description felt accurate. I spent the next hour digging through additional records. Property tax statements, county maps, deed documents, everything I could find. If Patrice had some legal justification for this project, I intended to discover it before confronting her. What I found instead made the situation considerably worse. Our deed contained a riparian rights clause. The language was straightforward. Ownership of the shoreline belonged to us. Control of structures built on that shoreline belonged to us. Access decisions belonged to us. The rights attached directly to the property. No exceptions. No HOA authority. No special provisions. Nothing. I leaned back in my chair. The legal language wasn't complicated. Whoever built that dock had no right to do it. The next question was even more important. Did the HOA possess an easement? Because if they did, that changed everything. An easement would provide legal access rights. It wouldn't necessarily justify construction, but it would create an argument. Without one, they had almost nothing. I searched county records, then searched again, then a third time just to be certain. Nothing. No recorded easement, no pending easement, no expired easement, no historical easement, no paperwork whatsoever. 30 years of county records, not a single document giving the HOA authority over our shoreline. By that point, I was ready to make a phone call. I found Patrice's number, took a breath, and dialed. She answered immediately. Her voice arrived bright and cheerful, the same tone people use at neighborhood picnics. Oh, you're back from Colorado. I wasn't interested in small talk. I reviewed our property survey. A brief pause. Then the cheerful tone returned. And? The dock is 14 feet inside my property line. Silence. Only for half a second, but I noticed it. Then came the response. Smooth. Prepared. Almost rehearsed. Well, what we're probably dealing with is a minor mapping discrepancy. I blinked. A what? A mapping discrepancy. She said it confidently. Like the phrase solved everything. Like unauthorized construction could be explained away with sufficiently creative vocabulary. I looked down at the survey. 14 feet, not 1, not 2, 14. And somehow that had become a discrepancy. These things happen with older surveys, she continued. We should review it together as neighbors. Neighbors. Interesting choice of words. I had called to report an illegally constructed dock. Patrice had transformed it into a friendly discussion over property lines. The woman was talented. I had to give her that. Wrong, but talented. I see, I said. I'm sure we can resolve this. Her confidence remained unshaken. Not even slightly. That bothered me. Most people became nervous when confronted with evidence. Patrice sounded relaxed, almost amused, as though she expected me to eventually agree with her. I ended the call politely, then hung up. Carol appeared from the kitchen almost immediately. What did she say? I rubbed my forehead. Apparently it's a mapping discrepancy. Carol stared at me, then laughed. Not because it was funny, because the alternative was throwing something. A mapping discrepancy. That's the official explanation. She pointed toward the window. That thing has support posts sunk into a lake. I noticed. People are docking boats there. I noticed that too, and it's a discrepancy. So I've been told. Carol shook her head. No. No? No. I reject that explanation completely. I couldn't argue with her. A knock sounded at the front door. I already knew who it was. Dennis entered carrying 2 sodas. He looked suspiciously pleased, the expression of a man arriving at the second act of a story he'd been following closely. Heard you talk to Patrice? News traveled fast, especially through Dennis. Sit down. He settled into a chair. I explained everything. The survey, the deed, the missing easement, the phone call, the magical transformation of illegal construction into a mapping discrepancy. Dennis listened carefully. When I finished, he nodded, then smiled. Oh, she used that one before. I frowned. What? The discrepancy line. He took a drink. 3 years ago. What happened? The Garcias. I vaguely remembered them. Nice family. Moved away several years earlier. The HOA claimed their fence crossed a property line. Dennis shook his head. Turned out the HOA measurements were wrong. I stared at him. So she's done this before? Similar strategy. That wasn't encouraging. What happened? The Garcias proved they were right. And? And then they moved. Dennis shrugged. Got tired of dealing with it. The room fell silent. I didn't like that story. Not at all. Dennis pulled out his phone. Oh, and there's something else. I immediately knew I wasn't going to enjoy whatever came next. What now? He scrolled through an email, then began reading aloud. Friendly reminder that the new community dock remains available for resident enjoyment from sunrise to sunset. I closed my eyes. Of course, there was more. Please remember to register usage through the QR code located at the entrance post. My eyes opened again. What? Dennis looked delighted. QR code. You're kidding. Nope. Carol lowered her book, slowly, carefully, like somebody processing dangerous information. She put a QR code on our property. Dennis nodded. Apparently. The room became very quiet. Then Carol spoke. I've decided I don't like Patrice. That was the moment something changed. Until then, I had been operating under a simple assumption that this situation could be resolved through conversation. A misunderstanding. A mistake, an overreach, corrected by facts. But the more information surfaced, the less convincing that theory became. Patrice hadn't accidentally built a dock. She had organized it, promoted it, advertised it, encouraged residents to use it, installed signs, created registration procedures, sent emails, formed committees. The dock wasn't an accident. It was a project built on land she didn't own. I looked toward the lake again. The structure sat peacefully against the shoreline, a symbol of somebody else's confidence, somebody else's assumption that they could simply take what wasn't theirs. The strange thing was that I still hadn't called law enforcement. At that moment, I genuinely believed documentation would solve everything. Property records, deeds, county maps, facts. Surely facts would matter. Surely evidence would matter. Surely nobody would continue defending a dock built 14 feet inside private property. I was still giving Patrice the benefit of the doubt, still assuming reason would prevail, still believing the situation could be corrected without escalation. Looking back, that was probably the last truly optimistic thought I had about the entire mess. Because before this day ended, I was going to learn something important. Patrice wasn't interested in facts. She wasn't interested in property lines, and she certainly wasn't interested in admitting mistakes, which meant the next step wouldn't involve another phone call. It would involve somebody with a badge. And when that happened, the entire neighborhood was about to discover just how expensive a mapping discrepancy could become. By the time I finished reviewing every document I could find, my patience had officially expired. The dock was still there. The boats were still using it. The sign was still inviting people to enjoy property that didn't belong to them. And somewhere in the neighborhood, Patrice was still sending cheerful emails about her newest community improvement project. I decided I had heard enough. It was time to involve someone who cared less about HOA politics and more about property law. So I called the county sheriff's non-emergency number. The deputy who answered listened carefully as I explained everything. The unauthorized construction, the survey, the deed, the missing easement, the HOA's claim of authority, the sign, even the QR code, especially the QR code. When I finished, he asked a few questions and took notes. Then he told me someone would follow up. I thanked him and hung up. And then I waited. The problem with waiting is that it gives you too much time to think. Every time I looked out the back window, I saw the dock. Every time I walked near the shoreline, I saw strangers treating it like a public marina. Every time my phone chimed with another neighborhood email, my blood pressure climbed another notch. The worst message arrived from Patrice herself. The HOA had apparently formed a beautification committee. Volunteers were invited to help improve the shoreline area surrounding the dock. Our shoreline area. Carol read the email over my shoulder. Then she lowered the phone. She's landscaping now. Apparently, on our property. Apparently. Carol shook her head. I almost admire the confidence. I don't. That evening, I prepared a formal demand letter. Not an angry letter. Not an emotional letter. A factual one. Survey attached. Deed attached. County records attached. Property boundaries highlighted. A direct demand that the dock and all related structures be removed immediately. I signed it, placed it beside the door, and prepared to send it. The next morning, my phone rang before I had the chance. The caller ID displayed one simple phrase, Sheriff's Office. I answered immediately. The deputy introduced himself as Deputy Harlan. His voice was calm, professional. The voice of a man who had probably heard every imaginable version of "This isn't my fault." He reviewed the information from my report and asked detailed questions. When had the dock been built? How long had it been there? Did I have documentation? Were there witnesses? Was there evidence the HOA had authorized construction? I answered every question. At the end, he said something that immediately caught my attention. I'd like to see it in person. Whenever you'd like. This afternoon, work? It works perfectly. After hanging up, I called Dennis. He answered before the second ring. The sheriff's office called. Silence. Then a quiet response. I'll be home. That sentence carried more excitement than most people could fit into an entire speech. Dennis wasn't missing this, not for anything. A few minutes later, I made one more phone call. Patrice, she answered immediately. Her cheerful tone appeared again, for the last time. I wanted to let you know, I said. A deputy from the sheriff's office will be visiting the property this afternoon. Silence. A long silence. Long enough that I checked whether the call had disconnected. Finally, she spoke. You called the sheriff? I did. Over a dock? No. I paused. Over a structure built on my property without permission. Another silence. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. The confidence remained. But the cheerfulness was gone. I think we may have gotten off on the wrong foot. Interesting. A week earlier, it had been a community improvement project. Then it became a mapping discrepancy. Now it was a misunderstanding. Patrice's vocabulary seemed remarkably flexible. I'd be happy to sit down with you and Carol and resolve this at the community level. At the community level. That phrase almost made me laugh. Apparently, county deputies qualified as an unacceptable level. I politely informed her she was welcome to attend the inspection. Then I ended the call. Carol listened from the kitchen. She wants to resolve it now? Apparently. How many emails did she send announcing the dock? 3. Carol nodded. Funny how quickly people discover compromise. That afternoon, Deputy Harlan arrived. He stepped out of his vehicle, carrying a clipboard, and the expression of a man who had no interest in neighborhood politics. Only facts. Exactly what I wanted. I walked him to the shoreline. For several moments, he simply looked. The dock, the boats, the sign, the storage box, everything. Then he pointed at the laminated notice. Your sign? No. He wrote something down. Then I handed him the survey. He studied it carefully, compared measurements, examined landmarks, checked boundary markers, measured distances visually. Then he looked back at the dock. 14 feet. 14 feet. He nodded. More notes. That was when footsteps approached behind us. I turned. Patrice had arrived, and she wasn't alone. Beside her stood a man carrying a leather portfolio. The HOA management representative, or, as I immediately thought of him, the poor guy who had been dragged into this disaster. Patrice introduced herself with her full title. President of the Lakeview Shores Community Association Board of Directors. Deputy Harlan nodded politely, then asked one question. Were you the individual who authorized construction? Patrice straightened. Yes. No hesitation, no uncertainty, no attempt to dodge responsibility. For a brief moment, I almost respected that. Almost. Then came the next question. Is there a recorded easement for this property? The confidence faltered. Only slightly, but enough. We operate under Community Development Authority. Deputy Harlan looked up. "Ma'am, I'm asking if there's a recorded easement." The management representative opened his portfolio, started flipping through pages, then more pages, then even more pages, the kind of frantic page-turning that answers a question before anyone speaks. No easement. Everyone knew it. Eventually, he stopped searching. "We would need to review the documentation." Translation: there wasn't any. Deputy Harlan wrote something on his clipboard. Slowly. Carefully. Meanwhile, Dennis happened to be trimming hedges nearby. The same hedges he'd been trimming for nearly an hour, the most thoroughly maintained hedges in the state. Patrice attempted several different arguments. The survey might be outdated. Property values benefited from the dock. The HOA acted in good faith. This was a neighbor dispute. Every attempt met the same response. Facts, records, documentation, law. Nothing else. Finally, Deputy Harlan said something that changed the entire conversation. "This is not a neighbor dispute." The shoreline became silent. Patrice stopped speaking. The management representative stopped turning pages. Even Dennis stopped trimming. Deputy Harlan continued, "This is unauthorized construction on private property." Then he added the sentence that ended the entire argument. "The county takes property violations seriously." Nobody had a response. Because there wasn't one. The facts were too clear. The dock sat on private property. There was no easement, no permission, no authority, no legal justification, only confidence. And confidence, it turned out, wasn't recognized by county regulations. Deputy Harlan photographed everything, collected copies of my documents, recorded measurements, then departed. Before leaving, he offered Patrice one final piece of advice. The HOA should consult an attorney immediately. The warning was professional, polite, reasonable. It was also unmistakable. The county already knew how this story was going to end. 6 days later, everyone else learned too. The official notice arrived. The county found that the dock had been constructed illegally. It had been built on private property, without owner consent, without a recorded easement, without required permits. The HOA was ordered to remove the structure entirely, restore the shoreline, pay all costs, and cover the accumulating fines associated with unpermitted waterfront construction. The neighborhood exploded. Someone accidentally forwarded the county notice to the community mailing list. Within hours, everyone knew. Every homeowner, every resident, every board member, every person who had received Patrice's enthusiastic dock announcements. Dennis called immediately. "The beautification committee has been dissolved." I laughed for the first time in weeks. That was quick. 11 days. Impressive. Shortest committee in HOA history. 3 weeks later, the dock disappeared. A professional crew arrived. Every board removed, every post extracted, every trace erased. The shoreline was restored exactly as it had been before. The HOA paid for all of it. The demolition, the restoration, the permits, the fines, every dollar, which became especially unpopular after residents realized the HOA budget came directly from their dues. Patrice stopped sending neighborhood emails. Nobody seemed to miss them. The morning after the final crew left, Carol and I carried coffee down to the shoreline. The lake looked exactly as it had 11 years earlier. Peaceful, quiet, undisturbed. No boats tied to our property, no signs, no logos, no QR codes, just water, sunlight, and our shoreline. Carol smiled. "You know what still amazes me?" "What?" She could have just asked. I nodded. She was right. One phone call, one conversation, a simple request. Maybe we would have said no. Maybe we would have said yes. Maybe we would have found a compromise, but it would have been a conversation. Instead, Patrice skipped the asking part and went directly to construction. That decision cost the HOA thousands of dollars, embarrassed the board, triggered county enforcement, and permanently changed how the neighborhood viewed its leadership. A few days later, Dennis joined me by the water. We stood quietly for a moment. Then he nodded toward the restored shoreline. Turns out building a dock on someone else's property is significantly more expensive than asking permission. I laughed. Apparently, he grinned. But the QR code? I already knew what was coming. Yeah? That was bold. I couldn't argue with that. The dock was gone. The shoreline was ours again. The HOA became remarkably quiet, and every neighbor in Lakeview Shores learned the same lesson. Property lines aren't suggestions, and confidence is a very poor substitute for permission. The end.